Hello, friends. Dr. David Katz here, taking a break from my workout to record my next COVID reality check video. And we can call this one, in accord with my next column now in the works, COVID and the Contagion of Caricature. And what I want to talk about is the significance of case counts and what they actually mean. I already talked about why denominator testing is really important in a prior video, but here I want to talk about how to interpret the fact that we have many more cases in the United States than we thought we had, or than some of us thought we had. Actually, I have long been suggesting we have at least 10 times more cases than we've documented. Many of my colleagues have as well, because 140,000 people in this country have died. And we know from global data that the fatality rate from COVID is a fraction of a percent. And so we can't possibly have had only 3 or 4 million cases in the US. We needed to have had close to 10 times that many to account for the mortality we've seen. And that, in fact, is the latest news. It's literally today's news in the New York Times, an article entitled "Coronavirus Infections Much Higher Than Reported Cases in Parts of U.S. Study Shows." And the study that's referenced, which came out yesterday in JAMA Internal Medicine, is entitled "Seroprevalence of Antibodies to SARS-CoV-2 in 10 Sites in the United States, March 23rd to May 12th, 2020. I'll put links to both below the video. But here's my concern about caricature. So, as advertised, the reporting and the study show that antibody levels in population sites around the country show that 10 times more people, at least, have had this infection already than we've documented. And that's sort of at a minimum, because this is just people who show up as positive on antibody tests. It takes a while to make antibodies. Some people don't develop those antibodies. Some people may have been exposed and never gotten infected. None of that's counted. It's just the people who've made antibodies. 10 times higher than we suspected. What that means is, okay, it isn't 4 million people in the United States who've had this infection. It's 40 million. And here's what worries me. This is being reported as doom and gloom news. So there are many more asymptomatic people out there spreading the virus, and the sky is going to fall. Well, we already know what the impact of asymptomatic people spreading the virus is. We know what's happening to hospitalization. We know what's happening to ICUs. We know what's happening to death. So, in fact, the visible part of the pandemic, and in my prior video I talked about icebergs and how epidemics are like icebergs. You only see the more severe cases. We've always seen the more severe cases. So this has absolutely no bearing on what's happening to hospitalization, ICU use, or death, because that is what it is. That's always been on display. What this means is 10 times more people have gotten through this infection and not needed the hospital, not gone to the ICU, not died, and in fact maybe had no symptoms at all, or symptoms too mild to report. We only found them when we finally went out and looked for their antibodies. So everything we've been hearing in the media about rates of hospitalization, rates of ICU admission, rates of death can now be reduced by an order of magnitude. So if 140,000 people in our country have died from COVID and 3 to 4 million had been infected, that's a mortality rate up around 4 to 5%, depending on adjustment to those numbers. That's stunningly high. That's really very concerning. But it's also way out of proportion to what the rest of the world has been reporting. But this adjustment by an order of magnitude says, no, 140,000 people have died, and that's terrible and tragic, obviously. But out of maybe 40 million people who have been infected already, if not more than that, which means the case fatality rate is 0.4%. You're 99.6% likely to recover from this. That's massively good news. The disturbing thing is even the mainstream media, even august sources of journalism like the New York Times, seem to have bought into the pandemic narrative, where you really have to choose your tribe and either say everything is doom and gloom, hunker in your bunker until there's a vaccine, and there can be no good news, or liberate my state immediately, never mind the nursing homes, the whole thing's a hoax. Both of these are absurd. It's a caricature of what's really going on, and it serves none of us well, to report news as if it's uniquely and exclusively good or uniquely and exclusively bad, and fail to interpret it and provide context. So the context here is 10 times more people have gotten through this infection than we had previously documented. And that means the overwhelming majority of cases are mild. And yes, it means there have been a lot of people spreading the virus around, but that doesn't change the numbers of people in the hospital now. If the numbers in the hospital are going up, they're going up. Do we need to be careful? Yes. Do we need to fastidiously avoid exposure of people who are older and people with major chronic disease? Yes, we knew all that. So social distancing, careful use of personal protection, use of masks and so forth. But again, that's established. That's the lore of pandemic response. But this is good news. The other thing that was noted is because even 10 times more case counts is still a long way from 60% of the population, we're a long way from herd immunity. They went out of their way to report we're a long way from herd immunity. Well, maybe, but we're 10 times closer than we were before we got this news. Why not note that? That 10 times more people have made it through this infection, and by the way, the vast bulk of those we hadn't heard about before made it through without any symptoms at all, which is why we didn't find them until we went looking for them. So we're closer to herd immunity. Personally, I think we're much closer to herd immunity because I think given these millions and millions, tens of millions maybe, of people who've been out there asymptomatic with the potential to spread the virus, means many, many more of us have been exposed. And if only a minority of us have gotten infected, I believe it's because many of us have native partial resistance, so we can get it, but we don't get it that easily. And I also believe that antibody testing is far from perfect because many people fight this virus off, apparently, without making the kinds of antibodies these tests routinely measure. Personally, I think the parts of the country that have truly been through a first wave, like New York City, frankly, like my home state of Connecticut, are actually much closer to herd immunity than the mainstream reporting implies. But I want to be humble about that. I don't know for sure. It's a hope. It's a data-driven hope. It's based on extensive review of the relevant literature. But at a minimum, if you find that 10 times more people in your country have had this thing than you realized yesterday, you think you would say, so, okay, there may be a long way to go to herd immunity, but we're 10 times closer than we were this time yesterday before we got this news. But no, we hear many people spreading it asymptomatically. This is more doom and gloom, and we're a long way from herd immunity, and the sky is falling. Okay, it's not exclusively good news, but actually this report, 10 times more infections, all of them minimally symptomatic or asymptomatic, is mostly good news. It's 95% good news, 5% bad news, but it was reported as if it was all bad news. My advice to you is to step back, think about the context, and don't play this game where every bit of news about the pandemic is distorted into a caricature. We can think through this better than that. There are things going on like the rising hospitalization rates in some parts of the country that are genuinely disturbing, but not every bit of news about the pandemic is disturbing or bad news. And frankly, I think it's encouraging that 10 times more Americans than we knew yesterday have already been through this, and the vast majority of them made it through just fine.